Donc là, on a une deuxième partie de notre matinée qui est consacrée toujours à ces questions d'éthique. Alors quand je dis toujours, vous avez vu tout à l'heure dans la présentation de Judy Illes qu'elle avait coordonné un Oxford Handbook of Neuroéthique avec Barbara Saakian. C'est un livre qui fait 900 pages, merci Judy, et c'est juste une Introduction to Neuroéthique. Donc, vous avez quand même un champ de la neuroéthique qui se développe aujourd'hui et qui reste maintenant à ouvrir, à compléter, comme on peut le voir. On a la grande chance de recevoir Jonathan Montgomery, qu'on remercie de venir de Grande-Bretagne ce matin, lui aussi, mais l'Eurostar a marché très bien. Et notre invitation est tout à fait orientée parce que c'était en 2013, le No-Field Council que Jonathan préside a publié un important rapport qui est disponible sur Internet, it's free on the Internet, sur le Brain Computing Interface, avec une approche assez particulière et tout à fait britannique, très pragmatique, très directe, des interfaces cerveau-machine. Et donc, on se réjouit d'écouter Jonathan nous parler de ce rapport du No-Field. Thank you, Jonathan.
Monsieur et Mesdames, je n'ai pas parlé français depuis 30 ans, donc il faut que je présente en anglais. I hope I've just said I haven't spoken French in 30 years, and I have to present in English. Did I? I don't believe it. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's already been a really interesting morning for me. I can just about translate the slides, but I really struggle with the spoken French, so I hope you'll bear with me when it gets to questions. I'm the chairman of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and that means that I have very little to do with the real work, but I can take the credit for it. I also chair something called the Health Research Authority, which is responsible for the oversight of Research Ethics Committee in England. And a little while ago, I used to chair the English or the UK Human Genetics Commission, so we were having our debates about discrimination. And we took the view as a commission that we should have something a bit like GINA in the UK. That was rejected by our government on the basis that our overarching anti-discrimination provisions already covered issues of genetic discrimination. Didn't persuade us at the time that that was the right move. But it's quite interesting in the context of other types of discrimination in relation to the brain, that if that does work, then it may deliver some of the anti-discrimination provisions in that context. We've dealt with the insurance issue by a voluntary moratorium on the use of genetic tests for life insurance, which more or less holds while there aren't very many molecular genetic tests. But of course, the insurance industry uses genetic information all the time in order to profile risk. So there's a whole debate there which we also are having. So, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics is broadly equivalent to the CCNA, although its remit is slightly different, its relationship with government is very different, and its membership is a little bit different, although I looked at the membership of the working party I'm going to talk to you about that published last year, and every single member of that working party is a professor. They're not all professors of medicine, but they are all professors. But I'll say a little bit about how it operates and how we try and learn what patients and the public thinks in a moment. So our report came out in the middle of last year, and it was focusing on a series of ethical, social, and regulatory issues around new technologies and emerging technologies involving and intervening in the brain. And what I want to focus on today is the elements of that which move us from discussions of the ethical principles, which are, as we noted, distinctively English, into an even more distinctively English approach, which is around how we try and make things happen in a practical way that we think are more ethical. So we set up our working party. It took approximately 18 months in order to go through its deliberations and produce the report. And the report is 267 pages, so it's short by some comparisons and longer by others. And in that process, we engage in a review of the evidence, but we also engage in two important ways in understanding what the broader public and patient groups think. We put on our website the opportunity to consult, and we review everything that comes back via that. And we have a series of fact-finding events where the working parties meet, mainly with people they've identified as having things to say, but also if representations come in, the working party will meet with people to hear their views. And at present, although we're reviewing this, that's our principal mechanism for connecting the discussions that our working parties have with the broader public concerns. The reports themselves go out to international peer review in order to make sure that we don't make mistakes, but also to enable us to reflect on how things might look differently elsewhere. So that's the context in which we're working. We're not a government body. We have no guarantee, therefore, to access to government policy making or the work of our regulators, but we work hard to try and influence their thinking, and I'll show you a few examples of that as we go through. So very quickly, in terms of the context, we identified a range of technologies, some of which are well known and used in clinics, where we're looking at deep brain stimulation. Others, which are much more about a research context, we set out in part to try and identify what might be non-medical usage of interventions in the brain. In particular, we thought it would be interesting to try and understand military interests and the gaming industry. We found relatively little that we could access that was really going on in those contexts at this stage. So it turned out not to be a significant focus of our report. We have some therapies which are sort of on the boundaries between the research and movement into the clinic. And we identified significant differences in the way in which we regulate these interventions, whether we regulate them as devices or whether we regulate them as clinical trials. And I want to come back to that a little bit later on. We have one important phase 1 trial, the Reneuron trial, looking at stem cell therapy for stroke patients, which took a very long time to get through our regulatory processes. And that was one thing in which we're reflecting on. We also identified a whole series of things that seem to make it difficult to identify and do the right things in this context. So I've talked a little bit about the different regulatory processes in grey. On the one hand, the stem cell therapies regulated as if it was a pharmaceutical trial, a clinical trial, a series of hurdles. We had at that stage a special ethics committee to look at gene therapies. In the course of the work of the Nuffield report, the Health Research Authority, which I became responsible for in the middle of the period, moved the special committee to look at gene therapy into the framework of its general research ethics committees. And that changed the timelines and the process and skilled up one of the particular committees to be able to look at those sorts of trials. But it remains a very complicated regulatory framework for stem cell trials. On the other hand, the regulation of devices is relatively light touch, and if you can show there is a similar device that does something more or less the same, it's much easier to get to clinical use and market. And as you'll see later on, one of our conclusions was that we probably needed something in between those sorts of regulatory structures. We were also identifying concerns over the scale of need for research into the brain, combined with the relative lack of investment in the pharmaceutical solutions to that was emerging as a number of funders, particularly those looking for relatively short-term returns, were not seeing the returns that would enable them to invest. So lots of research, publicly funded, less coming through, particularly venture capital. And we also identified one of the products of that being that people looking to protect their own investments and capitalize on their own markets. And in areas of uncertainty, we felt that created particular challenges as we tried to think through how we could get a grip on interventions in the brain. So, the Working Party came up with an ethical framework, which I'll then try and explain how we applied. It started from some reflections on what might be different about the status of the brain. So there's discussions, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, about what exactly is the connection between the brain and identity and autonomy, but particularly picked up both as part of the special characteristics, but also in terms of the importance of understanding the brain better, and in terms of the need to be careful we do, that the brain is an organ that repairs itself perhaps less effectively than others. It concluded from that that raised the importance of us needing to try and understand and carry out research in relation to neuroscience. But it also, and that could be translated into the traditional value of medical ethics as beneficence, but it also raised the stakes in terms of us realizing that it's possible to do harm that can't be repaired. It's also possible to undermine public trust. It's also possible that we might engage with some really important ethical values, and therefore we should be cautious about how we saw that imperative to do the right thing and learn how to do the right thing better for patients and balance that with an idea of caution. But Nuffield in this report and others is careful to draw a distinction between the value of caution, being wary, being careful about what you do, and what is sometimes used in some manifestations as the precautionary principle, which puts a restraint on you doing things until you're certain that things are safe. And that's not the argument that we were putting forward, because we felt that had to be balanced with the clear evidence of need and the commitment to try to do good. Hence, these things seen as a part of the foundational tension. So the Working Party went on to try and identify a typology of the key interests that were at stake. None of these are new, but they manifest themselves in subtly different but not unique ways in the context of neuroscience. So we have a set of challenges around safety, which are new in terms of physical interventions into the brain, although whether that's really a qualitative difference or whether intervening mechanically and intervening through medicines is that much difference is unclear, but we have questions we don't know the answer to around that. And particular problem identified come back to around how we might learn more about the impact of implanted devices when you have a model that expects the use of placebos to be able to explore that. Second set of key interests to be pulled out, and we've already touched a little bit on this, is how the work on the brain connects with our ideas of autonomy. We have a strong sense of the role of the brain in relation to identity. We also have questions around whether or not intervening in the brain alters not just identity, but your capacity to take decision-making. We have an important set of issues around the stake that's there when you interfere with the brain around how we get autonomous decision-making. But perhaps more interestingly, and again this came up in the presentation Judy gave us, a set of issues about what exactly are the privacy issues at stake when you gather information from people's brains. So we had the example of the experiment about how people respond to particular type of images, and we learned things from them that we might believe, but we don't really know, have predictive significance. Many of these research projects are going to collect information, and we won't know whether it's imaginary or real, whether it's likely to guide people's actions going forward, nor do we know how much of it is produced by the stimulation or just measured by the stimulation. So there's a key set of interests we have to understand around how we properly protect and respect participants' privacy. We too identified that there were discrimination issues at stake in relation to this research, and we categorized them in two particular ways. We categorized a set of issues around access to therapies and whether or not, if we allowed the development of these therapies in ways that would only be available to certain segments of the population or certain parts of the world, that raises challenges that we needed to build into our regulatory structure. But we also identified some of the potential for stigmatization and discrimination on the back of what was learnt. And then finally, we felt the potential for losing public trust is quite significant in this area. I've touched on some reasons already, but we were particularly concerned about the significance of unsustainable or overblown claims that were being made for the impact of neurotechnologies and the ability of that to undermine public confidence in very important clinical developments. And I'll give you some examples of our media response to that in a little while. So as we work towards a solution, we identified an approach driven by three important virtues. We're trying to capture how we're resolving that foundational tension that we described, and we started with how should we respond to the significance of need. And the virtue of inventiveness is designed to capture the fact that if there is a very significant human need we're trying to address, it is morally an imperative that we try to find a way around it, that we don't just accept ignorance and inability to help people. So it is important that we exercise the virtue of inventiveness by seeking to find a way through to understand better. On the other hand, it's also important to be humble about what it is that we can actually achieve, how much we know already, taking a step-by-step approach. And thirdly, it's important to exercise that humility with a high degree of responsibility, as this is a common project we're trying to learn from, and therefore it raises, and this happens in other areas as well, but really important questions about how this work creates a cumulative body of knowledge, how we ensure that the knowledge that's created is created with a degree of scientific integrity, and making sure that we continue to learn from the work that's done. So where did that take us in terms of concrete steps and moving towards some regulation? Well, we were very anxious about the lack of coordination of pulling together the knowledge that was being gleaned by particularly work on medical devices. So we argued that we should only permit these devices to be used in the context of collecting the clinical experience from their use. So we recommended an enhancement of the post-market vigilance systems, the collection of patient experience, and we've worked with professional societies to create a register for the use of DBS. We're discussing also with our colleagues in the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, which identifies standards for the provision of services in the NHS, National Health Service in England, around making sure that devices are used within a protocol with an audit tool so that we can capture collectively as a society what we know. We were also critical of the relative ease with which it was possible for new neuro devices to get access to the market on the basis that they were thought to work in a way that was similar to existing ones, the predicate device approval process. And we argued that the same concerns that led us to think in clinical experience we should make sure that we understand exactly what it is that patients experience and what the outcomes of work are, would apply also to non-clinical technologies, although, as I said, there are fewer of those than we first thought of it. And then in relation to that's the devices regulatory framework. We also had a look at the clinical trials regulatory framework and identified a number of problems that needed to be disentangled there. The first of which was already identified for other reasons as something of a mess in the UK. And that's the complexity of overlapping regulatory frameworks. I've already mentioned one aspect of that was that because we had been anxious a few years ago about gene therapies, we'd set up a separate ethics committee process, different from our normal research ethics committees, to look at trials that involved gene therapy. One of the consequences of that was that it had a mixed view of debating the ethics and approving trials. It met on a quarterly basis, and when it got towards actually there being trials to be done, it then looked like a very slow process. It didn't look like such a slow process when it was set up, but it became a slow process in the context. The assessment of our government was that more was now known about the ethical issues, and it became more like a standard approval process against a broadly agreed ethical framework. So, as I said earlier on, we've moved that process into our mainstream research ethics committee and designated 2 of our research ethics committees as experts able to review genetic stem cell genetic therapies. That doesn't mean we've stopped the debate. It means that we've taken the debate out of being a single committee and asked the ethics committee to review particular protocols. We've also tried to help researchers find their way through the process, and we've produced a regulatory map which doesn't reduce the complexity but makes it easier to find your way through. And one of our parliamentary select committees is keeping a close eye on whether that does actually streamline the process. So the argument there has been the bureaucracy has got divorced from the ethical reflection. And in itself, the bureaucracy has created a set of complexities which are unethical. Whether or not they make the right decisions is a different question from whether they do so slow. And I can see some recognition of the challenges. There's also a set of challenges which is around where what we're doing is less a trial and more an innovative therapy, doing the best you can, particularly in very dire, difficult, last chance type circumstances. And this is a very live debate in the UK at the moment. It's broadly thought by our politicians that the UK picks up innovation slowly, and they've been trying to reduce regulatory barriers to people trying innovative therapies. We have a number of concerns about that, but I think I'll just pick up 2. One is that if you reduce the hurdles to doing that, and actually we have very few legal hurdles in the United Kingdom to just trying things in the clinical context that might possibly work, and the new proposals possibly raise those thresholds, but we learn very little if all you do is try things. So we have a concern about the fact that actually, contrary to our politicians' view, we probably have insufficient regulation in relation to neurosciences of clinicians just trying things because they think they might work. But most importantly, we have insufficient mechanisms for making sure we learn from that. We may try a whole load of things and not properly capture the evidence, and we may not share it. So the key issue about this, and this has been taken up by our Health Research Authority as well as the Nuffield Council, is how we can create easy opportunities for people to share the information they've learned. So the next phase of research is built on an accumulation of knowledge. And then finally, we had a particular set of questions we identified in the report, which came to the Nuffield Council as a set of issues of uncertainties by researchers. They wanted to have clearer guidance about when they could or couldn't use, in relation to implants in the brain, a placebo, a comparator which was a sham surgical implantation, which would enable them to get what are thought generally in other contexts to be better quality evidence. But given the nature of the interventions, clearly reigns anxiety. So we've referred that to the Health Research Authority's National Research Advisors Panel, which is its group which reflects on challenges on particularly research ethics. And that panel has decided there's nothing new in neuroscience, that this is a standard issue about the use of placebos and not something particular about neuroscience, and has declined to issue what the council recommended, which was a specific set of guidance. So we're currently working with the specialist societies to take that through to what we think is its logical conclusion, which is that the Health Research Authority may not wish to make a specific pronouncement because it believes the ethical issues are not new, but if researchers are anxious, we can at least codify what those standard ethical principles produce in a way that gives confidence that people are doing the right thing. So not entirely a success from the Nuffield Council's point of view in terms of having an influence, but a piece of work in progress. And then we needed to look at what this means, this ethical framework, in terms of the obligation to look after participants or patients, as most of these things are involving patients. So we need to make sure they have access to the sufficiently independent advice to decide whether they wish to undertake these new procedures, given the sensitivities and the uncertainties that are there. We need to, and this very much picks up what Judy picked up in terms of incidental findings, we need to guard against the last best hope, the attempts to do things despite the fact that there's relatively little chance of us knowing whether they're going to work. By putting those in a context, an appropriate response which balances both the duty of care to the patient and also the duties to the wider society and the patients of the future, to undertake these experimental treatments in the context of protocols. And we also identified a particular set of issues, which again is a broader set of issues about clinical trials, about not just abandoning participants at the end of the trials if they've had therapies that either they perceive have helped or maybe we have objective evidence has helped. And we've recommended that should, in the relation to brain interventions, be built into the standard expectations as a requirement of ethics review. So that's the cautious approach. What does it look like when you read the UK papers? We're told that stem cells can rescue memory from Alzheimer's disease. We weren't told, unless you read the story very carefully, that was in mice. We have stories about miracle cures, the coma victim able to speak again, which strictly speaking is probably an accurate headline. That's to say there was a coma victim who was able to speak again, and there had been some magnetic field therapy, but whether there was any connection between the two is impossible to tell. The zapping the brain to bring out the genius of you sounds something that would be very attractive. And we were really concerned about the spiral of hype that was being encouraged. It's partly fueled by those economic drivers and constraints that people trying to grab a relatively small pot of money and therefore want to talk up what they're doing. We have particular issues in the UK where our government wishes to attract inward investment, where our funders of research and higher education want to be able to demonstrate the money they spend does some good. Otherwise, it won't be protected in times of recession and austerity. And therefore, there's a tremendous encouragement for people to claim things that they really can't demonstrate. So that might be about impact, which is entirely speculative. It might be about moving beyond what are appropriate extrapolations of the data into broad claims. It's partly about the encouragement all our universities are now putting on us to speak to our public and do so in a way they understand, and those miracle cure stories play into that. But there's very little interest in the wider media in things that are risky. There are some interesting things that go completely wrong, but not much interest in relatively minor side effects or uncertainty. So we identified that there are a number of things we needed to be really anxious about this. The risk of undermining public confidence in this whole enterprise because you build up a great expectation and then you dash the hopes because nothing is realized. The difficulties in that context of being encouraged to overclaim, of genuinely having a debate with participants about what you're asking them to do. The risks that the brain is the next big thing. We've talked a little bit about genetic exceptionalism in the discussions after the last presentation. There's a similar set of issues. You move from the public and the media being very interested in genetics and thinking somehow that explains everything. You move into thinking the brain explains everything. You then try and put the two together, as one of Judy's slides do, and maybe that helps or maybe it doesn't. But actually, if we overblow that, we're likely to see a backlash of investment, which is partly financial investment in trials, but also, most importantly, public investment in wanting to be part of this process. So the cross-cutting themes from our report are essentially that we recognize a really important need. These are serious health conditions that are being addressed. They're health conditions where our therapeutic options are much less than we would like. And there's good reason to think that this is a line of inquiry that might lead to effective therapies. The brain has a special status, whether that's based on some scientific objectivity or cultural issues. We therefore want to support innovation, but we need to protect our patients. We need to do so in a way that means that we don't ask them to do things without getting the proper return on their investment in the sum of human knowledge by collecting and disseminating the evidence. And we need to do that with actively managing the process of maintaining trust by being honest about what we do and don't understand and what the prospects are. So that's about 5 pages of 267. You can read the rest on a free download in the PDF, and thank you very much for listening.